If death is real, then what exactly continues, and what makes life morally coherent? Religion often answers with creation and an eternal verdict. Materialist science often answers with conception and extinction. Buddhism starts in a different place. It does not begin with a creator, and it does not begin with nothingness. It begins with conditionality. Whatever arises does so because causes and conditions support it, and whatever is supported by conditions will change when those conditions change. From that single principle, the Buddha's answer becomes practical and demanding. What you call a person is not a fixed soul that can be sentenced forever, and it is not a disposable accident that disappears without remainder. It is a living stream of conditioned experience, body, speech, and mind, shaped moment by moment by intention, habit, and grasping. If you hold that frame, the original question changes shape. Where do we come from? Becomes a question about continuity, about the momentum of mind, about why certain patterns repeat inside us even when we promise ourselves they will stop. Where do we go? Becomes a sober inquiry. If mind is shaped by conditions, then what conditions am I feeding? And what will that stream become when the body can no longer carry it? Buddhism does not ask you to replace fear with fantasy. It asks you to replace confusion with clear seeing, and to accept responsibility for the forces you cultivate. Many people begin with theistic explanations because they offer moral simplicity. A divine being creates you, watches you, judges you, then assigns you a final destination. The structure can feel stable, but stability is not the same as justice. Buddhism asks you to test the ethics of the system itself. If a perfectly benevolent, all-powerful creator chooses each birth, then the suffering of the innocent is not an anomaly. It is part of the design. The world is full of cases that strain such a design. Children who die before they can speak, infants born into severe disability, minds broken by illness from the beginning. If the answer is mystery, the moral question has not been answered. It has been postponed. Then there is the claim of eternal reward and eternal punishment. Even without anger, simple proportion raises a hard question. How can finite actions committed under limited understanding deserve infinite consequences? The idea may satisfy an emotional demand for absolute justice, but the more carefully you look, the more it resembles a cosmic transaction. Obey, believe, and you win. Fail, doubt, and you lose forever. Buddhism does not accept life as a business deal with the universe. It treats morality as training. Causes produce results because that is how conditions work, not because someone is pleased or offended. Materialism appears cleaner: egg, sperm, development, brain, mind, then death, then nothing. Many thoughtful people choose it because it seems disciplined. Buddhism does not need to fight that discipline. It can respect science and still point to open questions. One open question is consciousness itself. You can map brain activity, track signals, and show correlations with experience. But correlation does not settle the deeper issue of how first-person awareness arises at all, and why it is structured the way it is. Another open question is the persistence of patterns. Children sometimes show strong temperaments early, and while biology and environment account for much, the existential pressure still remains. If death ends everything, what exactly is the moral meaning of suffering and love? Some people can live well under that view, but many find that it quietly weakens the foundation beneath human seriousness. Buddhism offers a third way that is neither a courtroom nor a void. It says, look at experience directly. Notice that mind is a process, not a thing. Notice that everything you call me is changing. Notice that your reactions have momentum. Notice that what you repeatedly think, say, and do becomes easier to repeat. That momentum is karma, not fate, not punishment, not a supernatural score. Karma is intentional action of body, speech, and mind, and the way such action shapes the stream of experience. This is not mystical, it is observable. If you repeatedly respond to stress with anger, anger becomes the default channel. If you repeatedly train patience, patience becomes the default channel. If you repeatedly feed craving, craving grows strong and quick. If you repeatedly practice generosity, the mind becomes less cramped. From this perspective, samsara is not a mythological wheel in the sky. Samsara is continuity driven by ignorance and craving. It is the cycle of becoming trapped in patterns you do not fully see. It is how suffering reproduces itself even when you say you do not want it. You can see samsara in a single day. A harsh word triggers pride. Pride triggers defense. Defense triggers more harshness, then guilt, then more tightening. The cycle is not imposed by a god. It is built by conditions, by habit, by unexamined reflex. Now bring this view to death. Buddhism says, the body is a condition for certain forms of consciousness. When the body dies, those forms cannot continue in the same way, but the stream of conditioning does not become nothing. The momentum of intention, habit, and tendency does not vanish as if it had never existed. It continues as long as the causes continue. Rebirth, in this framework, is not a permanent soul migrating. It is the continuation of the conditioned mind stream when the body can no longer carry it, taking form again where conditions allow. There is continuity without a fixed identity. Like one flame lighting another, not the same flame, not unrelated. The error is to demand a solid object called my soul that remains identical. Buddhism refuses that object because clinging to it is part of the suffering. If this sounds abstract, Buddhism often uses simple analogies to make one point. Continuity does not require sameness. Consider a river. You call it by one name, but the water is never the same water. The river is a process, a flow shaped by landscape and rainfall and gravity. In the same way, what you call a person is a process shaped by causes and conditions. Memory, temperament, attention, fear, desire, kindness, ignorance, all of these arise and pass, shaping what arises next. When the body ends, the question becomes whether the causal stream ends absolutely or continues to reconfigure. Buddhism argues for continuation, not because it is comforting, but because it fits the logic of conditionality and the observable momentum of mind. At this point, it is important to correct a common misunderstanding. Buddhism does not say, nothing matters because you will be reborn anyway. It says the opposite. Because the stream continues, what you do matters more, not less. If you believe death erases everything, there is a temptation, subtle or strong, to treat life as a one-time grab for pleasure, status, or security. Many people resist that temptation through ethics and love, and that is admirable. But Buddhism says, even without an external judge, there is a moral physics. Cruelty shapes the mind into a cruel place to live. Greed shapes the mind into a hungry ghost. Hatred shapes the mind into hell. Generosity shapes the mind into spaciousness. Compassion shapes the mind into relief. The afterlife is not primarily a destination, it is the continuation of the kind of mind you have been building. This is why Buddhism speaks of realms not as places but as states of existence. A heavenly realm is a state of ease, pleasure, and subtlety, but still impermanent because it depends on conditions. When conditions end, the state ends. A hell realm is a state of intense suffering, fear, and torment. A hungry ghost realm is chronic dissatisfaction, endless wanting, a thirst that cannot be quenched. An animal realm is dominated by confusion and fear, a life of survival without clarity. The human realm is mixed, and that mixture is exactly what makes it precious. Enough pain to motivate practice, enough clarity to do it. The Asura realm is power and achievement, mixed with anger and rivalry. The mind that can accomplish much, but cannot rest. Even if you interpret these realms as psychological descriptions rather than literal cosmological locations, their insight remains. You have met people who live in hungry ghost states while surrounded by abundance. You have met people who live in hell states while outwardly successful. You have met people who live in heaven states for a season and then collapse when the season ends. Buddhism is pointing to a simple fact. Mind constructs worlds, and karma shapes the conditions under which those worlds are experienced. Now ask the question in a sharper way. Why do human beings differ so deeply? Why does one person seem naturally gentle, while another seems naturally volatile? Why does one mind incline toward generosity, while another clings with fear? Buddhism answers without blame and without flattery. It says, streams of mind carry tendencies. Some arrive with refinement from wholesome conditions. Others arrive with agitation and anger. Others arrive with confusion. Others with grasping. Others with heavy consequences that shape body and circumstance. This explanation can be misused if it becomes a weapon of judgment, but properly understood, it leads to compassion and responsibility. If suffering has causes, then suffering can be addressed. If tendencies are conditioned, tendencies can be retrained. Here, Buddhism offers something more valuable than explanation, a path. Karma is not a prison sentence. Karma is conditioning, and conditioning can be transformed. The Buddha did not teach rebirth to satisfy curiosity about metaphysics. He taught it to make the ethical and contemplative path serious. If actions and intentions echo forward, then training the mind is not optional. If craving and ignorance keep the cycle turning, then weakening craving and ignorance becomes the most practical work a human can do. A short story makes this concrete. Kisagutami lost her child and broke apart. She carried the dead body from house to house asking for medicine, refusing to accept what had happened. People avoided her because grief without wisdom can become contagious. It frightens others because it shows them their own future. Finally, someone sent her to the Buddha. She begged him to save her child. He did not debate philosophy. He said, "Bring me a mustard seed from a house where no one has died." She ran from door to door. In every home, death had already visited. A parent, a sibling, a child. No household was untouched. As she realized this, her mind shifted. The pain did not vanish, but it became connected to reality instead of fighting reality. She returned with empty hands, and the Buddha had given her what no miracle could give, a way out of the madness of denial. The lesson is not, everything dies, so do not love. The lesson is, everything changes, so do not cling as if life is a possession. When you stop demanding that reality reverse impermanence, grief becomes sorrow, and sorrow can be carried without destroying you. This story also shows the Buddhist style of authority. It is not authority that commands belief. It is authority that reveals a fact you can verify. People die, conditions change. Clinging creates suffering. Seeing clearly changes suffering. From that clarity, a person can begin to live differently. Now, when people hear about karma and rebirth, they often fear fatalism. They imagine a universe that is rigid, where everything that happens to them is deserved. Buddhism rejects that crude idea. Karma is only one set of conditions among many. Biology is a condition. Society is a condition. History is a condition. Accidents are conditions. Other people's actions are conditions. The world is complex, but within complexity, intention still matters, because intention shapes the mind's direction. Even if you cannot control all circumstances, you can train how you meet them. That training changes your next moment. Over time, it changes your character. Over deeper time, it changes the stream itself. This is why the Buddha emphasized right effort. Right effort means you do not wait for salvation. You do not outsource your mind to fate. You practice preventing unwholesome states from arising when you can. If they arise, you learn to abandon them without hatred. You cultivate wholesome states, kindness, patience, generosity, clarity, and you learn to maintain them. This is not moral perfectionism, it is practical training. It is the difference between a mind that is constantly pulled by craving and aversion and a mind that can rest without being dragged. Meditation is central because it makes the invisible visible. Without meditation, many people think their mind is who they are. With meditation, you see thoughts as events, not as identity. You see emotions as waves, not as commands. You see craving as a pressure, not as a necessity. You see fear as a story, not as a prophecy. This does not make you cold, it makes you free enough to respond wisely, and that wise response is the seed of a different future. Another Buddhist story shows transformation where it seems impossible. Angulimala was a murderer. People called him a monster. If the universe were an eternal courtroom, he would be condemned forever, and the story would end there. But the Buddha approached him without fear and without hatred. Angulimala tried to chase him and could not catch him, and when he shouted for the Buddha to stop, the Buddha replied that he had already stopped hatred, stopped illusion, stopped the inner running. That one line cut through Angulimala's mind. He realized that his own mind had never stopped, not once, not even after killing. It was still driven, still hungry, still burning. He renounced violence and trained as a monk. He still suffered consequences. People threw stones. He was injured. Karma ripened. Buddhism did not erase cause and effect, but Buddhism showed that the mind could change direction. Even heavy karma is not a final identity. The stream can be redirected by insight and sustained effort. This is the Buddhist kind of hope. Not a promise that pain will be removed by someone else. Not a promise that consequences will disappear. It is the hope that the mind is trainable, and therefore suffering is workable. It is the hope that ignorance is not permanent, and therefore samsara is not eternal. At this stage, some people ask for external proof. Buddhism is careful. It distinguishes between direct knowledge through meditative insight and indirect knowledge through reports and investigation. There are documented cases of children reporting past life memories with specific verifiable details. Researchers have collected and analyzed such reports. Some thinkers have argued that continuity of consciousness is not obviously impossible if you treat mind as a process dependent on conditions rather than a fixed substance. None of this is a final proof, like a laboratory measurement repeated under controlled conditions. Buddhism does not require you to pretend it is. Buddhism asks you to avoid two dishonest moves: blind belief and blind dismissal. Intellectual integrity means you admit what you do not know, you examine evidence without prejudice, and you test what can be tested in your own mind. But the deepest power of the Buddhist view does not depend on rare cases. It depends on the fact that you can already observe continuity. You can see how habits persist. You can see how a single angry reaction makes the next angry reaction easier. You can see how repeated generosity changes your sense of self. You can see how clinging makes you anxious. You can see how letting go brings relief. In that sense, rebirth is an extension of a principle you already know. What you cultivate continues. The question is not whether you like that principle. The question is whether you will use it consciously. Now, return to the original human question with less confusion. Where do we come from? We come from causes and conditions, from a stream shaped by the past, meeting the present. This includes biology and environment, yes, but it also includes the momentum of intention and habit that the Buddha called karma. Where do we go? We go where the stream goes, shaped by what it has been trained to do. If it has been trained to cling, it will cling. If it has been trained to hate, it will hate. If it has been trained toward generosity and clarity, it will open. The Buddhist path exists for one reason: to change the training at the root, to weaken the ignorance and craving that keep the cycle spinning. Nirvana, in this frame, is not a place you win. It is not eternal pleasure. It is the ending of the conditions that generate compulsive becoming. When craving ends, the mind cools. When ignorance ends, the mind sees. When the mind no longer builds identity on what is impermanent, suffering ends. This is not a metaphysical trophy. It is a practical freedom. It begins here, in the way you meet the next moment. It deepens as the mind becomes less owned by habit and more guided by insight. If you want a simple checkpoint, it is this. Watch what happens when your pride is triggered. Watch what happens when you want something you cannot have. Watch what happens when you are afraid. In those moments, you can see samsara being built. You can see how quickly the mind creates a story of me and mine. You can see how suffering is manufactured, not because the world is malicious, but because the mind is conditioned. And if you can see that, you have the first tool needed to change it. So the Buddha's answer is not mainly about explaining the universe. It is about ending unnecessary suffering. It says, do not turn life into a transaction with an authority, and do not turn life into a meaningless accident. See conditionality, see karma, see samsara, train the mind, and understand that continuity is not your enemy. Continuity is what makes transformation possible. If nothing continued, there would be no path. If everything were fixed, there would be no freedom. The middle way is that things continue because of causes, and therefore causes can be changed. The question, where do we go, then becomes less a panic and more a responsibility. Not responsibility as guilt, but responsibility as ownership of training. You are already training your mind, whether you notice or not. Every day you strengthen something. The only question is whether you are strengthening what binds you or what frees you. And that is the most Buddhist way to take an existential question seriously without falling into fear. And once you see that you are always training something, you begin to notice the places where your training has been accidental. You did not sit down and choose most of your habits. They formed because they were useful at the time, because they protected you, because they helped you survive, because they helped you belong. A child learns to hide anger because anger is punished. Another child learns to perform because performance earns love. A teenager learns to chase approval because loneliness hurts. An adult learns to control everything because uncertainty feels like danger. These habits are not sins in the Buddhist sense. They are conditions. They are the mind adapting, often without awareness. But what begins as adaptation can harden into a prison. Buddhism calls that prison ignorance, not stupidity, but not seeing clearly how the mind manufactures suffering. This is why Buddhist teaching often feels less like a belief system and more like an instruction manual. It keeps returning to one question: what conditions are present and what do they produce? When craving is present, what does it produce? When aversion is present, what does it produce? When delusion is present, what does it produce? And then, what happens when these conditions weaken? What happens when attention becomes stable? What happens when compassion becomes natural? What happens when you stop taking every thought personally? If you want to understand samsara in a way that is not mystical, look at a simple sequence. Someone criticizes you, the mind tightens. It produces a story. They disrespected me. That story produces heat. Heat produces words. Words produce consequences. Then regret appears, or justification appears. Either way, the mind continues to spin. The suffering is not only in the criticism, the suffering is in the chain reaction. Buddhism is interested in the chain reaction. It says, if you want to know where you are going, look at what you do when you are triggered, not what you do when life is easy. The direction of the stream shows itself under pressure. Now place the 6 realms into this daily reality. The hungry ghost realm is not just a myth. It is the mind that cannot be satisfied. It eats and remains hungry. It buys and remains empty. It wins and remains anxious. It does not want pleasure. It wants relief, and it mistakes pleasure for relief. You can see hungry ghost energy in modern life everywhere. Scrolling that never ends, consumption that never fills, ambition that never rests. Buddhism is not shaming desire. It is pointing out a pattern. Craving promises fulfillment, but produces more craving. That is why it is called hunger. The hell realm is the mind dominated by torment, fear, rage, bitterness, despair. Again, not as a place of flames, but as an experience that burns. People can live in this realm while appearing functional. Their body goes to work, but their mind is at war. The animal realm is the mind dominated by confusion and survival, not because the person is inferior, but because clarity has been replaced by reflex. The person reacts, repeats, escapes, numbs, and does not understand why. The Asura realm is the mind driven by rivalry. It can build empires, but it cannot be at peace because it is always measuring. The heavenly realm is comfort and pleasure, sometimes earned, sometimes granted by conditions, but still unstable because it depends on conditions. And the human realm is mixed. It can be painful, it can be beautiful, and because it is mixed, it can awaken. This interpretation matters because it prevents a dangerous misunderstanding. If you treat realms as permanent identities, you turn Buddhism into another system of labeling. If you treat realms as conditioned states, Buddhism becomes usable. You stop asking, "Am I good or bad?" You start asking, "What realm am I feeding right now?" When you feed jealousy, you feed the Asura state. When you feed compulsive wanting, you feed the hungry ghost state. When you feed hatred, you feed hell. When you feed confusion, you feed animal. When you feed calm generosity, you feed heaven-like states. When you feed mindfulness and wisdom, you move toward liberation. This is also why Buddhism can talk about rebirth without making it a fantasy. If a mind spends decades strengthening a certain realm state, it is not strange to think it may reconfigure into conditions that match that training. If you train hunger, you may continue in hunger. If you train hatred, you may continue in hatred. If you train clarity and compassion, you may continue in clarity and compassion. This is not a threat. It is a neutral description. Training continues unless it is interrupted. A short story from the tradition makes this point without metaphysics. A man came to the Buddha and asked a question similar to yours. What happens after death? The Buddha did not answer in the way the man expected. Instead, he asked the man to consider a burning fire. If the fire goes out, where does it go? East, west, north, south? The question itself is wrong because it assumes a fixed thing that travels. The fire depended on fuel, oxygen, and heat. When conditions changed, the fire ceased. In the same way, the Buddha said, the question, where does the self go, assumes there is a solid self to locate. Buddhism does not grant that assumption. It focuses on conditions. If conditions for craving and ignorance continue, the process continues. If they end, the process ends. The point is not to map a destination. The point is to understand what keeps the process running. This is where the idea of non-self becomes central, and it must be handled carefully. Non-self does not mean you do not exist. It means what you call I is not a permanent, independent core. It is a bundle of processes. Body changes, feelings change, perceptions change, thoughts change, even your sense of identity changes. When you cling to any of these as me in a rigid way, you suffer because reality will not cooperate. You cannot freeze a river and still call it a river. You cannot demand permanence from what is conditioned. People often resist this because they fear it will make them cold. But the opposite tends to happen when it is understood correctly. When you stop treating the self as a rigid object that must be defended, you become less defensive. When you stop treating life as property, you become more able to love. When you stop believing that your anger is you become able to see anger and not obey it. Non-self is not a philosophy to impress others. It is a tool to reduce suffering. Now, the question of fairness returns here in a sharper form. Theistic models struggle with fairness because they assign infinite outcomes to finite lives and struggle to explain innocent suffering. Materialist models struggle with fairness because they offer no moral continuity beyond one lifetime. Injustice can simply win. Buddhism offers a different kind of fairness. It does not promise that good people will always look happy and bad people will always look miserable in the short term. That is not true. It also does not promise that life will be equal. It offers moral continuity through causes. It says, actions have consequences, sometimes immediate, sometimes delayed, sometimes hidden. A person can appear successful while living in an internal hell. Another can appear poor while living with a mind that is free. Karma does not guarantee external comfort. It guarantees that intention shapes the stream. That is the level at which Buddhism claims fairness, not in the distribution of superficial outcomes, but in the structure of cause and effect. This is also why Buddhism insists that karma is not only what you do to others, it is what you do to your own mind. If you lie, you do not only harm someone's trust, you train your mind to split reality. If you speak harshly, you do not only harm someone's feelings, you train your mind in aggression. If you indulge in envy, you do not only suffer privately, you train your mind to perceive lack everywhere. These trainings become your world. You cannot hide from them. The universe does not need to punish you. The training itself becomes the punishment. And the same is true in the other direction. If you practice generosity, the mind becomes less contracted. If you practice truthful speech, the mind becomes cleaner. If you practice patience, the mind becomes less reactive. The training itself becomes the reward. Again, no judge required. At this point, it is helpful to state the Buddhist position as simply as possible. Rebirth is not, my soul goes into another body. Rebirth is, the conditioned stream continues when conditions allow. Samsara is the continuation of that stream when it is driven by ignorance and craving. Nirvana is the ending of ignorance and craving, and therefore the ending of compulsive continuation. Karma is intentional action that conditions the stream. If you keep those definitions clean, the teaching stays grounded. Now, you may ask, if there is no permanent self, who is responsible? Buddhism answers, responsibility belongs to the stream. You may not be the same person you were yesterday, in a strict sense, but you are the continuation of yesterday. You inherit what yesterday did. If you drank poison yesterday, you suffer today, even if your cells have changed. Continuity carries consequences. In the same way, the mind stream inherits what it conditions. Responsibility without a permanent soul is not only possible, it is how ordinary life already works. There is a story that is often used to show how craving creates suffering even when it gets what it wants. A monk once complained to the Buddha that his practice felt dry, that he missed the pleasures of his former life. The Buddha asked him about a time before he became a monk. The man remembered a day of pleasure, food, sensuality, and excitement. The Buddha asked, "And after that day, did craving stop?" The monk admitted it did not. It demanded more. Then the Buddha asked, "So when you fed it, did it become satisfied or did it become stronger?" The monk understood. The point was not to condemn pleasure, it was to expose the mechanism. Craving is not cured by consumption. It is strengthened by consumption. Once you see that, you stop treating craving as a friend. You begin to treat it as a fire that needs less fuel. This is important because the promise of rebirth can also be misused by the mind as a form of delay. People may think, I can fix myself later, in another life. Buddhism does not support that laziness. It says the opposite. Because the stream continues, the habits you strengthen now will likely continue. If you delay now, you are training delay. If you indulge now, you are training indulgence. If you cultivate clarity now, you are training clarity. There is no safe postponement. The next moment arrives quickly, and it is shaped by the previous one. This is why the human realm is described as uniquely valuable. It is not because humans are superior in a prideful sense. It is because humans can reflect. A being in intense suffering may be too overwhelmed to practice. A being in intense pleasure may be too distracted to practice. The human condition includes both. It can force you to face suffering and also give you enough stability to learn. That is why Buddhism sees human birth as a precious opportunity, not because it guarantees happiness, but because it makes liberation possible. Now, you asked for more Buddhist stories and reflections that do not become ornamental. Here is one that speaks directly to the habit of clinging to views. A man once held a wrong view about spiritual practice. He argued loudly with others, certain he was right. The Buddha compared such clinging to views to holding a poisonous snake incorrectly. If you grab a snake by the tail, it can turn and bite you. The problem is not the snake. The problem is the way you hold it. In the same way, even true teachings can harm you if you hold them with ego, with rigidity, with the need to be right. The purpose of a teaching is release. If you use it to tighten your identity, you have missed it. This matters here because rebirth, samsara, karma, and nirvana can become new identities. I believe in rebirth, therefore I am superior. That is just another samsaric pattern. Buddhism asks for a different relationship. Use the teaching to see suffering, and then let the teaching do its work. This leads to a practical question. If karma is conditioning, what should a person do today? Buddhism answers in a way that is surprisingly plain. Guard the mind, train speech, train action. Not because morality earns you heaven, but because morality stabilizes the mind so wisdom can arise. If you live with constant harm, the mind becomes restless, defensive, and confused. Wisdom does not easily grow in that soil. If you live with restraint, honesty, and kindness, the mind becomes less divided. Wisdom grows more easily. This is why ethics, meditation, and wisdom are linked. Ethics reduces chaos. Meditation reveals the mind. Wisdom cuts ignorance. A small example shows how this works without mysticism. Imagine someone who speaks harshly as a habit. They may justify it as being honest, but harsh speech often contains hidden aggression. Over time, it trains the speaker to see others as opponents. That creates isolation. Isolation feeds bitterness. Bitterness feeds more harshness. The person then claims the world is unfriendly, but the world they live in has been shaped by their speech. Karma here is not a cosmic punishment. It is a self-built environment. If that person trains right speech, truthful, timely, kind, useful, they do not become weak. They become clearer. Their relationships change. Their mind changes. The world they live in changes. That is karma in action. Now, when discussing evidence for rebirth, the Buddhist approach is sober. It does not say, believe because a scientist said so. It says, look carefully at what you can verify and be honest about what you cannot. There have been investigations into children's reports of past life memories, sometimes with verifiable details. There have been thinkers who argued that continuity of consciousness is not irrational, and that dismissing it without examination is not the same as refuting it. But Buddhism does not rest the entire path on these reports. The core of the teaching is available without them. You can verify that intention shapes suffering. You can verify that craving increases restlessness. You can verify that compassion reduces internal conflict. You can verify that clinging to a fixed self produces fear. These verifications do not require an afterlife claim. They require attention. And yet, the afterlife claim matters because it influences how seriously people treat their training. If you believe life is a single roll of the dice, you may still practice, but you may also feel that deep transformation is optional because the end will wipe the slate anyway. If you believe continuity is real, then training is not optional. It is the most rational investment you can make because it shapes not only a mood, but the trajectory of consciousness. This is why the doctrine of rebirth can bring peace, not because it promises a pleasant future by default, but because it removes the despair of finality and the panic of now or never. Here is the humane value Buddhism offers. No one is a permanent failure. In a system of eternal verdicts, one mistake can cost you forever. In a system of extinction, your growth can be meaningless because it ends in nothing. Buddhism offers a middle position. Growth is real, consequences are real, and transformation is possible because continuity exists. If you did harm, you can train to stop harming. You may still face consequences, but the stream can change direction. If you lived in confusion, you can cultivate clarity. If you wasted years, you can begin now. The past does not vanish, but it does not have to dominate the future. This is not sentimental. It is simply how conditioning works. New conditioning can weaken old conditioning. Insight can cut through habit. When people hear that, they sometimes ask, so is rebirth a comfort? The answer is, it can be, but it is not meant to be a lullaby. It is meant to be an ethical awakening. If mind continues, you cannot escape your own training. If mind continues, you carry your habits the way you carry a scent on your clothes. You may change locations, but the scent follows until you wash it out. The Buddha's teaching is about washing the mind, not through ritual, but through insight and practice. If we return once more to the question, where do we come from? Buddhism would ask you to look at your current mind as evidence of continuity, not proof of past lives, but evidence of conditioning. Notice the habits that feel older than your conscious choices. Notice the way fear arises before thought. Notice the way certain desires appear without invitation. Notice the way certain moral instincts are strong in you, while others are weak. Whether you attribute these to biology, environment, karma, or a mix, Buddhism gives you a workable approach. Do not fight the habits blindly. Study them, see their triggers, see their promises, see their costs, then train differently. This is how you change destiny without needing a supernatural rescuer. So the teaching circles back to one firm point. The central question is not only what happens after death. The central question is, what conditions am I cultivating right now? Because those conditions are already shaping your next hour, your next year, and, if continuity holds, your next life. The Buddha's answer is not meant to make you speculate endlessly. It is meant to make you practice. When you practice, the question becomes less tormenting, because you are no longer demanding a guarantee. You are building clarity. You are building a mind that can meet change without panic. And if you want to know what it means to end the cycle, do not imagine an explosion of light or a dramatic escape. Imagine something simpler and more radical, a mind that no longer needs to cling, a mind that can feel pleasure without being enslaved by it, a mind that can feel pain without turning it into hatred, a mind that can face uncertainty without trying to control everything, a mind that does not build a rigid self out of passing conditions. That is what liberation points to, not an afterlife reward, but the end of the inner machinery that keeps producing suffering. If you say, this is still too large, take one small practice as a test. The next time desire arises, do not obey it immediately and do not suppress it violently. Watch it. Notice where it lives in the body. Notice what story it tells. Notice the promise it makes. Then notice how it changes when you do not feed it. If you can do this even once, you have seen a small piece of freedom, and that small piece is not separate from the largest questions. It is the same principle at work. Conditions arise, conditions pass, and you can learn not to be owned by them. That is why Buddhism can address the deepest human question without requiring you to surrender your intelligence. It does not say, believe and be saved. It does not say, accept nothing and be brave. It says, see clearly, train wisely, end suffering at the root. And from that, the question, where do we come from and where do we go, stops being an abstract debate and becomes a mirror. It shows you what you are doing with your life right now, and it offers you a way to change the direction of the stream before the body's conditions run out. If you want to continue this inquiry honestly, the next step is to examine more closely how samsara continues through body, speech, and mind in everyday life, and how karma is strengthened or weakened through specific choices, not in theory, but in the small moments where people usually say, it doesn't matter, because those are the moments that train the mind most deeply. The moment you choose a harsh word, the moment you choose to lie, the moment you choose to indulge resentment, the moment you choose to help, the moment you choose to pause and see. The Buddhist view is that nothing is wasted. Every intentional moment leaves a trace, and those traces are the real answer to where we are going.
possible.